Beau is Afraid is a 2023 surrealist comedy from writer-director Ari Aster, the mind behind the brilliant horror films Hereditary and Midsommar. It stars Joaquin Phoenix as Beau, a middle-aged man who is defined by his fears, Patti LuPone and Zoe Lister-Jones as his mother, and Parker Posey as the love of his life, Elaine. Before I get going, I should probably get into what I'm not going to talk about here. I'm not really going to get into a Freudian reading of the film, or even particularly touch on the elements of the film about a controlling mother and repressed son. Yes, this element of the film is clear. This is a film about a son of a mother who keeps a giant cock and balls locked in her attic. But I think there is more going on than that. I'm also not going to get into the symbolism of the water. Yes, Beau is called Wasserman. That means waterman. He is from Wasserton, or Watertown. And yes, the water is symbolic of amniotic fluid, with the multiple times he submerges himself being him trying to return to the safety of the womb. The film ending on the grim irony that water is what eventually ends his life. That's all a given, as is the fact that yes, it's safe to assume that most, or perhaps even all, of the characters Beau meets in the film are employees of the Mona Wasserman Industrial Complex. I'm also not going to recount the plot. There are plenty of videos that do that, and if I tried, you would probably call me a liar at a certain point anyway. Some have argued that it is the world seen through the eyes of someone who is anxious and paranoid, and it is that, but perhaps more importantly, it is a world that supposes that those paranoid and anxiety-fueled thoughts are real. For example, from the outset it is clear that Beau believes that everyone he meets is judging him, and from the outset we are explicitly told that they are. This culminates with everyone he has met over the course of the film, and perhaps his life, gathering to literally judge him. Some have even argued that this film is seen through the eyes of his mother, a distorted caricature of his life that seeks to absolve him of blame for his own death and take it all on herself. For what it is worth, I don't think this theory particularly works, but it's a lot of fun to watch the film through that lens. And it is precisely because it lends itself to being viewed with different interpretations in mind that I have found it holds up particularly well to repeat viewings. But the real question of these theories is ultimately, is this really happening? And I think that is answered in the section of the film where Beau watches a play in the forest, and finds himself so spellbound by it that he begins to internalize it, making it his lived experience. He finds a home, meets a woman, gets married, has sex, has 3 children, has it all ripped away from him, and then embarks on a perilous journey to be reunited with his lost family, and ultimately is culminating his stereotypical hero's journey with a stereotypical Hollywood happy ending. But he is then snapped out of this fantasy by the realization that it can't possibly be true, as he has never had sex. I think this shows us that the film we are watching is entirely the invention of an unreliable narrator. Someone not just lying to you, but lying to themselves. There is no way to discern reality from unreality. You just have to accept it for what it is. And the question many will ask is there value in such a story? A story that is a complete fabrication even in its own text. Maybe not, and maybe people who hated Beau is Afraid can't get past this obstacle. But all fictional stories on one level or another are complete fabrication, and the question instead becomes, what is the purpose of a story? Is there a purpose at all when this dazzlingly well-made but perhaps completely inconsequential section of the film is essentially a fantasy within a fantasy told to us by a liar? A story that isn't true can still tell us a lot. About who is telling it, about their view of the world, and perhaps about the world that made them. So what is truly at the root of Beau's fears? You know what I'm going to say here because I made it the title of the video. But while Beau has constructed a world that places his mother at the center of a giant web of despair, tugging on strands to manipulate the misfortune that rains down upon him, I think his mother here is also a metaphor for capitalism.
What?
I know.
After all, in the text of the film, she owns not just the building Beau lives in, seemingly employs literally every character who appears in the film, owns the companies that produce the disgusting mass-marketed food he eats, the pharmaceuticals that keep people compliant, who rifles through his medical history, spies on his every move, and even produced the film itself. She is every element of capitalism that crosses Beau's path. And as he is an unreliable narrator, projecting his neuroses onto the world and actualizing them through this story, Why can't we make this leap? That he is projecting his issues the only way he knows how, onto the person he blames for making him this way. So when we look at the abusive relationship, we shouldn't simply look at the abusive relationship between a mother and son, but between a capitalistic society and those who struggle in it. Because Mona Wasserman isn't real. But the circumstances reflected in the film broadly are, albeit presented in the absurdly heightened form of the surrealist comedy. The neoliberal capitalist world we live in really does use fear, antagonism, aspiration and othering to sell its products, to maintain a status quo and to keep us trapped in its system, just as much as the world Beau lives in, seemingly entirely created by his mother, does to him. That is not to ascribe a singular motive or single antagonist like Mona Wasserman. In the real world there is no one person or shady cabal pulling the strings, and to think so would be the deluded ramblings of a paranoid mind, as it is in Beau is Afraid. They are results, products, byproducts, consequences of a world geared towards profit with no thought given towards the psychological damage that can cause. Take commercial news stations, here hyperbolically proclaiming the danger of the ludicrously childishly named birthday boy stab man, an apparition that, of course, materializes into reality soon after the idea is seeded in Beau's mind. And this reflects news outlets like Fox News.
The surge in crime.
Rising crime.
A surge in crime.
Crime wave.
Surge in crime.
Crime wave.
Rising crime rates.
Surge in crime.
Crime wave.
Full-scale crime wave.
Massive crime wave.
Rising crime wave.
Who in 2022 materialized a crime wave to coincide with that year's midterm elections, presenting American cities as lawless hellscapes, and then decreased its coverage of violent crime by roughly 50% once the midterms were over, while ignoring that the crime rate across America actually fell from 2021 to 2022. And despite a rise from pre-pandemic levels, violent crime has been declining steadily since the 1990s. And just as how this threat materializes for Beau, the attitudes of the American population do not reflect that the world they live in is objectively less scary than it was 30 years ago. Fear of crime is used not just as a campaigning tool and in turn to justify ever more funding for the police, but also because it generates the most interest, with "if it bleeds, it leads," a herald cry for race-to-the-bottom journalism, those in the media knowing that pantomime villains sell better than nuance. Something intensified in the internet age by the need for hot takes to keep commenters at the forefront of the social media discourse, and headlines needing to instantly grab the attention to be noticed in that crowded media landscape, a phenomenon you will probably know as clickbait. Nuanced takes exist, but they are boring. And are you going to click on a mealy-mouthed article about how crime rates aren't as high as some reports say, or the gruesome details of yet another tragic death before tuning into the latest episode of Dead and Pregnant? Fear sells not just in news but in general, and while Beau as a young man was bombarded with adverts telling him that Wasserman brand razors were perfectly safe, implying that other razors were perhaps not, that reflects the way brands are marketed in the real world. Take Listerine, a surgical antiseptic, dandruff cure and floor cleaner, until some advertising bright spark had the idea of marketing it as a mouthwash, with campaigns that famously created a social stigma around the idea of bad breath, turning Listerine into a multi-million-dollar company. In a quote that originated in the 2005 book Freakonomics, University of Florida professor James B. Twitchell summed it up. Listerine did not make mouthwash as much as it made halitosis. And that is just one famous example. The history of advertising is littered with the use of social stigmatization to sell products. From cigarettes that keep you thin, tonics that will kill hair loss germs, olive oil that reverses wrinkles, or just plainly trying to scare you over the impacts of greying hair. These are things that will happen to most of us as we age, and they have certainly all happened to Beau. While greater regulation of advertising standards has meant that most, but not all, modern adverts don't overtly stigmatize in that way, that has been replaced over time by impossible standards of beauty in advertising, not just for women but also for men, no longer stigmatizing you for what you are, but for what you are not. And perhaps it is not a coincidence that as Beau aged out of these ideals, and it became instead the embodiment of the average middle-aged man we meet in the film, that he is slowly phased out of the advertising for Wasserman products, still aimed at him but no longer reflecting him. Fear doesn't even necessarily come from those with ulterior motives. We have all been ill at one time or another and found ourselves Googling our symptoms. And while you probably haven't been directed straight to obituaries and deadlysideeffects.com, you probably won't have had your fears allayed by doing so. Is that nagging cough, bronchitis, or cancer? Why not both?
Everything causes cancer is not the conclusion you want to draw from science. It's the conclusion you should draw from logging on to WebMD, where that is their motto.
This is particularly true for those predisposed to hypochondria and worry anyway, and even has a name, cyberchondria. But you don't need to look at a television, read a newspaper, or browse the internet to have fear instilled in you. In Beau is Afraid, you can just look out of a window. And just as how many of these on the face of it homeless people may perhaps be in the employ of Mona Wasserman, and I may be wrong, but I think I can pick a few out of this collage, homelessness in the real world is also a choice. As Dr. Gus Bagakis said in an article for Truthout, the fear of homelessness helps capitalism maintain its power. In the days of industrial capitalism, the unemployed were used by the ruling capitalist class to signal to the workers that they were lucky to have their jobs. And if they rebelled, they could be unemployed. Now, after the 2007-8 recession, as we move further into post-industrial capitalism, the homeless are a warning to those potentially rebellious workers unhappy with their loss of wages, lack of stability and benefits, and to students of the zero generation, zero jobs, zero hope, zero possibility, zero employment, who are in debt for their schooling. The message is, accept the declining status quo, or end up homeless. The emergency measures to temporarily house the homeless during the COVID-19 pandemic are proof that we have the resources at hand to end homelessness long term if we choose to. And that's not me saying that, it's the Prince of Wales. And he lives in a castle. If he can see it, what's your excuse? Maybe you live in the suburbs, and as Beau is Afraid shows, the fears there may not be as overt, but they are still palpable. And the exploration of their dark underbelly is such a staple of media that it has essentially become its own genre.
Ray, this is Walter.
But you don't need the heightened worlds of David Lynch, Joe Dante, or even this film to feel uneasy about the suburbs. A symbol of capitalist aspiration that became a form of economic segregation, cocoons of manufactured unreality that sprang up around America during the post-war economic boom, with a reliance on cars for commuting to work and to the nearest conveniences, and layouts that led to what the author of The Fractured Metropolis, Jonathan Barnett, describes as a culture of impersonality, all of which combines to create a form of middle-class existential ennui. The happy facade of Roger and Grace reflects the very real suburban pressure of keeping up appearances while they struggle with the loss of their son, and masks a prescription drug problem that mirrors the real-life suburban opioid crisis. And their daughter, Tony, while obviously a comical exaggeration of the troubled suburban teen trope, a melange of boredom, alienation, and misplaced anger. But when shows like Euphoria were criticised for their depictions of drug abuse among suburban teens, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration estimated that there were actually around 1.6 million children aged 12 to 17 in America who had a substance abuse disorder in 2020. And then we come to Jeeves, the troubled army veteran, discharged after having a mental breakdown and attacking his own squad.
Not the enemy, his own squad, too.
His own squad, Beau.
He was defending himself. He still is. He's a hero, and he came back to nothing. We're the only ones who would take him in.
He's gonna be so ashamed in the morning, Beau.
I think it's fair to say that this is a representation of PTSD, something which the US Department of Veteran Affairs estimates 7 out of every 100 US Army veterans suffer from, a statistic that should perhaps be weighted against another statistic, provided by Chris Diaz, the White House liaison to that department, that only 10% of those who enlist in the military actually engage in combat. These are, of course, casualties of capitalism, particularly in America where the relationship between defense contractors and the state is so pervasive. It even has a name, coined by Dwight D. Eisenhower as the military-industrial complex. A statistic provided by the progressive think tank the Institute for Policy Affairs, and reflected by every other source I can find, shows that in 2021 the United States spent more on its military than the next 9 highest spending countries combined, and nearly double the other 144 countries in the world combined, rising again in 2022 and 2023, and set to rise even further in 2024 at the expense of a cut to non-defense spending. And this was despite President Biden in 2021 pledging to end these forever wars.
And it's time to end the forever war.
But, as Jacob Silverman writing in the New Republic said, the forever wars don't seem to end. They just molt into their next iteration. As assets are shuffled around, missions rebranded, and local allies reassured that we are there to advise and assist for as long as is needed. The business of war is an economic necessity in this capitalist economy. Promises of jobs and investment in states, essentially hostages that ensure continued defense spending, such as the promises by Lockheed Martin, a defense contractor who in 2020 received more government funding than the Department of Education, largely for their failed F-35 projects. Jeeves himself seems like a pretty silly name for a veteran, taken as it is from the Butler Jeeves from the P.G. Wodehouse Jeeves and Wooster stories.
Well, I don't see how that helps us, Jeeves. If you will bear with me, sir.
And perhaps it reflects how soldiers serve not just the state, but the interests of capital, a goal of American foreign policy made explicit in 1980's Carter Doctrine, a promise to protect national interests in the Middle East using the US military. And that is where I will go back to the play put on by the Orphans of the Forest. What I think Aster is doing in this section of the film is critiquing media that functions as a panacea, simplistic stories with simplistic messages. This theatre of dreams that becomes a dream of theatre is a thinly veiled satire of media, with its cliched heroes' journeys and trite morality, no more able to resist the sledgehammer of reality than it is able to resist an arrow to the chest, creating expectations and ideals it wants us to exemplify, but which we can never truly live up to.
I feel sick.
And more importantly, it is critiquing the people who unquestioningly accept those stories, internalize them, who truly believe these stories are about them, those who can't even think through the logic of their own bullshit and notice that it's falling apart. This isn't the first time Phoenix has taken on a character who reflects a male struggling to come to terms with modern society, after 2019's Joker. And I think it is important that while Beau and Joker's Arthur Fleck are sympathetic portrayals of male loneliness and anxiety, they are films that both deal with varying degrees of success, with the psychological damage of their surroundings, and perhaps most importantly, men for whom the targets of their blame are largely misplaced. Beau is, on the face of it, an unusually cruel name to give to a child you think will never have sex, coming as it does from the French word for masculine beauty, and being one half of Beau and Belle, words often used to describe male and female lovers, and to some inclined to more old-timey language, a word that can be used interchangeably with boy or man. In many ways, Beau is a reflection of how many boys and men are increasingly struggling in modern society. This is partly down to the impact of deindustrialization, but can also be seen in poorer educational outcomes for boys compared to girls in major economies, which in turn has led to that trend being reflected in participation in higher education. While in both the UK and America, the number of men taking their own lives has been climbing steadily for the last 20 years. The alt-right specifically have targeted and groomed disaffected males, either through online grifters like Andrew Tate, weaponizing overt misogyny to create revenue streams like his Hustlers University, slightly more eloquent online grifters like Jordan Peterson, who seek to place the blame on modern feminism and advocate enforced monogamy, or literally mobilized as in how Steve Bannon targeted online gaming and incel communities, referring to them as unmarried straight white dudes who couldn't get laid, while understanding that they were truly characterized by a lack of economic opportunities and penchant for conspiratorial thinking. There is a power to conspiracy theories that attracts those who feel powerless, a coping mechanism that ascribes your feelings of helplessness to a single malign force. And research has long been finding links between conspiratorial thinking and feelings of victimhood, alienation, antagonism, and paranoia.
If you weren't afraid, if there were no consequences,
I know the truth.
Would you ask your mom? I'd ask her Just tell me the truth. Do you feel she didn't tell you the truth? Yes.
A Freudian analysis of Beau is Afraid works precisely because Beau truly believes that his relationship with his mother is the source of his problems. But he also truly believes that she keeps a massive penis in her attic, that everyone he meets is in her employ, that she controls the entire world and uses that control solely to subjugate him. Do you believe all of that too? Ari Aster has taken all of Beau's paranoid fears and made them real, because to him, they are. But that doesn't make him right. He isn't. And at the same time, Aster has littered the film with the real causes, curated every aspect of this journey and story, because while Beau is oblivious, we, as viewers, are not. Beau is Afraid places us in the mind of an unreliable narrator, a broken forever child, without the capacity to understand the societal forces acting on him, who has constructed a wild conspiracy theory to explain his issues, failing to understand that he is really stricken with the psychological damage and existential malaise inflicted by the neoliberal capitalist world he lives in. And the value of that story is in seeing right through it. Thank you very much for watching. I appreciate you listening to this. It means you've made it all the way to the end. I should make clear that this is just my take on Beau is Afraid. If you saw it differently to me, I'd love to hear your interpretation, so please feel free to comment below and I'll get back to you as and when I can. If you enjoyed this, please like and share the video. That stuff really helps. And if you want to see more of this sort of content, please subscribe to the channel. All of your support is very much appreciated.